There is one important problem in all of science which turns up in many forms in each area of science. It's like a pattern. And there's a root cause of this problem which I will try to discuss today. Every theory of science has some axioms or assumptions. And these assumptions describe some facts correctly, but not all of the facts. The facts which are described by the theory can be collected to form a set. Things inside the set are explained by the theory, but things outside the set are not. To explain the things outside the set, we have to add some new assumptions to the theory. Now you can search for these assumptions, and let's suppose that you find those assumptions which explain the facts outside the set. Now you obtain two types of assumptions. One, those which explain things inside the set, and second, which explain things outside the set. You can say that to explain things both inside and outside the set, we can combine the assumptions that respectively explains things outside and inside the set. The problem is that the moment you combine these two types of assumptions, you create a self-contradiction. This contradiction means that the inside and the outside of the set have to be treated differently. There is some fundamental difference between inside and outside, and you cannot break that boundary and bring everything inside. There will always be something outside which contradicts the inside. So every theory has some facts which lie outside the current explanation, such that all theories remain incomplete. But if we try to make the theory more complete by adding more assumptions to explain the currently unexplained facts, then the theory becomes inconsistent. So we are stuck between a rock and a hard place. The rock is that science is incomplete, and the hard place is that if we try to make it complete by adding more assumptions, then the theory becomes inconsistent. The reason for this incompleteness is that nature is constructed from opposites or duality. Wherever there is hot, there must be cold. So there are axioms that work for hot, but we must postulate the opposite axioms to explain cold. We cannot mix these two types of assumptions or axioms because it leads to a contradiction. But as we talked about in the previous podcast, we can organize these assumptions in a hierarchy. For example, there is a head and tail of a coin, and there is the coin which has both opposites. So first we go from consistency within the head to contradiction between the head and the tail. Then we go from this contradiction to a new consistency that emerges from the notion of a coin. Science is unable to make this transition because it lacks hierarchy. So we just describe the head, and then when we find the tail, we end up in a contradiction. We have to recognize this contradiction as the outcome of duality, and then rise higher in the hierarchy to find a new type of consistency. So contradictions are a stepping stone to deeper truth. If we get stuck with contradictions, we don't progress in knowledge. So this is the pattern for all theories in modern science. And it was conclusively demonstrated by Godel in his incompleteness theorem. This theorem shows that any theory that deals with numbers must be either inconsistent or incomplete. The theory is incomplete if it remains with just the head. The theory becomes inconsistent when it has to deal with both head and tail. And mathematicians are averse to this inconsistency. So they never talk about the tail, they only talk about the head. Since we do not incorporate the tail, we don't go deeper from head and tail to the discussion of the coin. And since we don't go deeper, the knowledge remains incomplete. In a sense, we are unable to deal with duality of this world and then the unity from which this duality springs. We just remain on one side of the coin. Every modern theory of science uses mathematics, which relies on consistency of the axioms. So every theory of science is unable to deal with duality, and therefore the theory is incomplete. Because we are unable to deal with duality, we cannot progress into deeper levels of reality to find a new unity. Hegel came close to describing the world as thesis and antithesis, which combine to form a synthesis. And the synthesis then becomes a new thesis with its own antithesis. But in mathematics, we can only have the thesis. Adding an antithesis to mathematics creates a contradiction. And if we are unable to deal with this contradiction, we never progress into the synthesis. Therefore, every theory of science which relies on mathematics and consistency of logic becomes incomplete. This means that every theory talks about some head of the coin, and then another theory talks about the tail of the coin, and these two theories remain mutually contradictory. Each theory is by itself incomplete, and incompleteness means that there are true facts, such as the tail of the coin, which the theory which never be able to prove or disprove. Or if we try to explain the tail using the same assumptions as we were trying to explain the head, we will end up in a contradiction. If we try to make the theory more complete, then we require two types of assumptions for explaining the head and the tail, which makes the theory self-contradictory due to the conflict between the old and the new assumptions. So this is a pattern for all of science, because it's a pattern for mathematics. This idea is formally stated in Godel's Incompleteness, but nobody has diagnosed the problem to its root in duality. This is because, since Greek times, rationalism operates on the notion that the world is consistent. So contradictions cannot exist inside the world. If we allow contradictions, we break logic itself. The incompleteness of science is due to logic, which says that all things must be consistent. The fact is that the world is not consistent. It has opposites like head and tail, which combine to create a coin. So we have to accept the contradiction, then rise deeper to obtain a new type of unity. This requires a new type of logic, which Hegel anticipated when he spoke about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.